Chair, I present to you Anthony Barnett for admission to the Honorary Fellowship of Goldsmiths, University of London. Author, journalist, and campaigner, he was the first director of Charter 88, one of the founders of the website magazine Open Democracy, and co-director with Henry Porter of the Convention on Modern Liberty. For over 30 years, he's campaigned tirelessly for democratic reform, writing numerous books about the need for constitutional change, including Debating the Constitution with Caroline Ellis and Paul Hurst, Power and the Throne, This Time Our Constitutional Revolution, and The Athenian Option, Radical Reform of the House of Lords with Peter Carey. Prior to the general election of 2015 and the 2016 referendum, he wrote a prescient article entitled "Those Good Old Boys, the End of Trust in Our Political Elites and Its Consequences." During the run-up to the referendum, he published an online book on the Open Democracy website in the form of a chapter a week entitled "Blimey, It Could Be Brexit." It alerted its readers to the possible outcome of the plebiscite, which took place on the 23rd of June 2016. He subsequently published The Lure of Greatness, England's Brexit and America's Trump with Unbound books, described in The Guardian as one of the most important political books of 2017, and in the Irish Times as the best book about Brexit so far. It traces the present discontent with politicians, both in the United Kingdom and the United States, back to the Iraq War of 23, and what he describes as 4 great betrayals of the public trust. If there are occasional tinges of "I told you so" in The Lure of Greatness, Fintan O'Toole wrote in a review, they are entirely justified. He did tell them so. What he was telling them, which is to say the establishment he labels the political and media caste, to emphasize the fluid movements of its members between journalism and PR and Westminster, he goes on, were in part things that any sane observer could have said in any Western democracy, that the disruptions of neoliberal globalization and its rising inequalities would have profound political consequences. But he was also telling them something very specific to Britain, that English nationalism was on the rise and that it had to be given a political form in keeping with its best democratic and egalitarian tradition. Otherwise, it would become an enormously disruptive force. Refusing to condescend to those who voted to leave the European Union, Anthony takes their complaints with the utmost seriousness, even if his characterization of Prime Minister Theresa May's project, unification of the Tory party when it was on the edge of disintegration by playing the big British card, appears to have been overtaken by events. As an undergraduate at Cambridge, Anthony was elected chairman of the University Labour Club with an eye on a parliamentary career. Disillusioned by the policies of Harold Wilson's new Labour government, however, by the time he graduated in 1965, he was a Marxist and a follower of Sartre. He's never joined a political party since. Instead, he became a member of the editorial committee of the New Left Review, working briefly as the journal's business manager before studying for a master's degree in sociology at Leicester University. Then, in 1967, Anthony joined the BBC, making science documentaries for Horizon. He decided against taking up a permanent full-time position because, as he puts it, it was 1968, for those of us who remember that, the year of revolutionary unrest. He began to write articles, first for Black Dwarf, and then for the short-lived radical weekly 7 Days. Anthony then undertook what he calls his first serious writing for the New Left Review about the disastrous government of Edward Heath. He worked for New Left Books for a year, developing the business strategy that would turn it into Verso Books, before undertaking serious research on the history of Vietnam as a fellow of the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam and with visiting fellowships at Cornell University in the United States. He also began to write regularly about Indochina for the New Statesman and occasionally for The Guardian. His reports for the former were published under the New Statesman imprint, along with John Pilger's, as Aftermath, the struggle of Cambodia and Vietnam at the beginning of 1982. Anthony's first book, Iron Britannia, Why Parliament Waged its Falklands War, appeared later in the same year. In 1986, having written the Islander Diary for the previous 2 years, Anthony applied unsuccessfully for the editorship of the New Statesman. Announcing another change in political direction, he wrote a trenchant letter from a would-be New Statesman editor, in which he explained that he was fed up with bloody Britain, with all the inertia and pretensions of its mediocre institutions and their sheer fatal resistance to change, and that he was also fed up with the conservatism of the left. His insistence on the need for democratic transformation in the UK found a focus in a direct response to the Thatcherism of the 1980s, the pressure group explicitly concerned with constitutional change, Charter 88. It called for a new constitutional settlement, which, among other things, would enshrine by means of a Bill of Rights and such civil liberties as the right to peaceful assembly, to freedom of association, to freedom from discrimination, to freedom from detention without trial, to trial by jury, to privacy, and to freedom of expression. Anthony was director of Charter 88 until 1995. In 2001, he founded the pioneering e-zine, or website magazine, Open Democracy, with Paul Hilder, Susie Richards, and David Hayes, acting first as its editor and then as its editor-in-chief until 2007, when he handed it over to Tony Curzon. While initially Anthony conceived of the venture in traditional publishing terms, given his background, its trajectory was fundamentally changed by 9/11 as an impassioned international debate about the appropriate response to the atrocity led to a huge increase in visits to the website, making it much easier to land sizable grants, especially from American charitable trusts. In November 2002, the e-zine, which Professor James Curran describes as historically important, was successfully relaunched. By the end of 2004, James explains, Open Democracy had ceased to be a replica political weekly and had come to resemble only itself. It was a hybrid, drawing on different cultural forms: print journalism, photojournalism, art installation, book, academic seminar, and political meeting. It continues to be significant. Currently, it's investigating who's behind the dark money, bankrolling our politics, revealing that US Christian fundamentalists, some linked to Donald Trump and Steve Bannon, have poured at least $50 million of dark money into Europe over the past decade. In addition to writing books, such as The Lure of Greatness, Anthony remains a regular contributor to Open Democracy. In 2011, he wrote a foreword to a new edition of Raymond Williams' seminal study, first published in 1961, The Long Revolution, which he describes as one of the essays of which he is most proud, and it's freely available on the Open Democracy website under the banner, We Live in Revolutionary Times. But what does this mean? Anthony tells me that the essay had its origin in a riposte to Terry Eagleton, written for the New Left Review in the 1970s, after Eagleton had disparaged Williams as being, quote, contaminated by idealism, and that it was this exchange which marked his break, Antony's break, from Leninism. As you'll have gathered, there have been several changes of direction in Antony's politics, as there have been in British politics, tout court. One of his fascinating recent articles for Open Democracy seems to echo a line in T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets: John Smith and the path Britain did not take. When we lost John Smith, Antony argues, we lost a leader who would have taken Labour and Britain down the path of radical and necessary reform of our constitution and political culture. It's an opinion with which I have considerable sympathy. Antony still harps on about constitutional reform and why Britain needs a written constitution. Given the current political shambles, it is a proposition that is increasingly difficult to argue against. Chair, I present to you Anthony Barnett for admission to the Honorary Fellowship of Goldsmiths, University of London.
Well,